Welcome to Positive Read-Ins. Today's video is in part a response to a recent Jared Henderson video that looked at the top 20 greatest philosophy books. And my argument is that there's a fatal flaw in this video, and that is there is no book by Arthur Schopenhauer. For me, this indicates perhaps academy capture or HR philosophy, which is a species of Richard Gere Buddhism. If you're not sure what Richard Gere Buddhism is, take a moment to think about it. And while you do, I would like to remind everyone that they can support this channel and discover new literature by getting a copy of this novel, Commuting. You can link to it in the description. You can also link to the Gymnasia Press website, where you can get the short story collection Comorbidities and my first novel, Non-Local. Get all three and you can help me get a new shirt, or at least an iron. First, I'd like to say that this video is not an attack on Henderson. I actually quite like his positions on mobile phones and physical books. However, I do think that it is almost a grave injustice to leave out Arthur Schopenhauer, and that's why I'm making this video, and also to talk about Arthur Schopenhauer. So the structure of Henderson's video is a response to Garvey's 20 greatest philosophy books, and really a correction on that. Now, Garvey actually included Schopenhauer. He included this book here, The World as Will and Representation, but Mr. Henderson has left that out, and he hasn't really mentioned why. This reminded me of back in 2014, after a period of several years of reading a lot of Schopenhauer and also maybe all the other great names of the Western philosophical canon, I noticed that many writers and speakers, when they're talking about philosophy, they would often mention Hume, Kant, skip over Schopenhauer, and then mention Nietzsche. Occasionally, they would have Hegel in there, but usually it was those three. And I was watching a video by Noam Chomsky, an older one, where he did the exact same thing. I reached out to Professor Chomsky, and I talked about this, what's going on here in the academy, this silence on Arthur Schopenhauer. And he responded by saying that he agreed that his work, unfortunately, was not brought up enough. He actually cited this work here, Schopenhauer's dissertation on the fourfold root of the principle of sufficient reason, which is a work of epistemology. And he said this is something he finds very valuable and does return to, but unfortunately does not bring up enough. Another writer who does the same thing coming out of the academy is William Barrett, who this is a pretty interesting book on existentialism, which I'm going to talk about more near the end of this video. Same thing though, but ironically, he's aware of this problem. The title of this video that I'm making is Professional Deformation, which actually comes from this book. I could have also called this video Jared Henderson Left the Academy, but the Academy hasn't left Jared. But in this, he mentions that philosophy is largely an academic pursuit. It largely belongs to the academy, and that has had a deforming effect on it, though he himself doesn't acknowledge what that is and doesn't even think about how that might relate to Schopenhauer. And I mentioned, well, why Schopenhauer? Because in this book, he also says that in order to really understand Nietzsche and Nietzsche's problems, we need to go back to his sources. Yet, arguably, maybe Nietzsche's greatest source is Schopenhauer. And again, if you go into the index here, there's no mention of him. So what was Mr. Henderson's argument for leaving out Schopenhauer? Well, he doesn't actually say, he doesn't even mention Schopenhauer, but he does give an argument for why he included this obscure book, which even the translators can't agree on how to translate it. Is it mind or is it spirit? Anyone who's read this can attest to its obscurity. But the reason to include this, according to Henderson, is Kant is the beginning of German idealism, and Hegel is its, what's the word he used here, is its fulfillment. My question is, well, why is German idealism even important? And perhaps it's not important. What I think is important is actually Kant. Kant really disrupted the world of philosophy, specifically with Critique of Pure Reason, and I would say maybe even more specifically with the Transcendental Aesthetic, which is maybe about 20 pages in the beginning of that book. And this disruption really created the birth of, we'll say, two strong sons. We've got Hegel and we've got Schopenhauer. And from those two writers, we've had some descendants. So for Hegel really lives on today in Marx, in Marxism, and Schopenhauer really lives on, maybe I would say unfortunately, because it's kind of a demented version of living on, through Nietzsche. However, Schopenhauer also lives on in a kind of a much more diverse set of thinkers. I actually discovered Schopenhauer through the work of literature, through Melville, Kafka, Beckett, and Knut Hamsun, all writers that mentioned Schopenhauer, and that's actually what led me to go on and read Schopenhauer. But also, Schopenhauer was quite influential on many other 20th century thinkers. So I'm thinking of, within the world of psychology, we've got Freud and Carl Jung. Both were devotees of Schopenhauer. And in science, you have Einstein, Heisenberg, and Schrödinger. So despite having this great influence on the world of philosophy and other thought, Schopenhauer is usually kind of disparaged as being a pessimist or a misogynist. And usually if people mention his pessimism, I think that's a pretty good indication that they haven't really read much of his work. Or he's just mentioned as being an important influence on Nietzsche, which I would equate to mentioning Beethoven as an important influence on Wagner. That's clearly not where the importance of Beethoven lies. In reality, to use Harold Bloom's phrase, I would say that Schopenhauer is Nietzsche's greatest anxiety of influence, and that Nietzsche spent most of his life in his writing trying to respond to kind of this deforming effect that Schopenhauer had on him. Nietzsche wouldn't be the first German writer to go mad because of a philosopher. The great writer Heinrich von Kleist also went off the deep end on reading Kant, though he did produce some great short stories in between there. So, how do these writers Hegel and Schopenhauer have their effects on the world today? In the culturally significant contemporary philosophy, we see it's Marxist, which is Hegelian with the dialectical materialism, which in this book they got some really absurd kind of depictions of this with something he calls self-moving concepts. So these would be kind of like concepts that don't reside in the mind, but they kind of move around freely and interact with each other. This is why Schopenhauer really kind of was quite brutal on Hegel. Also, I would say Marxist philosophy is ultimately optimistic, a Hegelian optimism that believes in kind of the formation to a greater fulfillment of something and you wouldn't see that in certainly in Nietzsche, who's deriving his thought from Schopenhauer. We have to acknowledge that Nietzsche is very critical, important to establishing maybe the most irritating and maybe pernicious school, which would be the postmodernism. And this is coming out of Nietzsche's perspectivism, this idea that there are no facts, only interpretations, regardless if that's true or not. The other branch, which I would say is also Nietzschean, and so would Barrett in this book is existentialism, and that kind of the core thought, which, without going too far into existentialism, as Sartre said, it is existence precedes essence. I don't actually think that Nietzsche would agree with that, and definitely Schopenhauer wouldn't, and all the other major philosophers that came before him would not agree with that metaphysical or ontological description that existence precedes essence. But there you go. That's kind of the contemporary philosophy we see today, mainly. So Marxists, postmodernists, existentialism. So while I think Marx has some interesting things to say, unfortunately, I think his followers often do not. And I think that Schopenhauer can be the answer, the antidote to this dominance of Marxist and Nietzschean philosophy. And for that reason, perhaps that's why he is kind of pushed out of the academy. I should also mention that Schopenhauer had a great impact on Heidegger as well. I'm not going to go into the details on that, but if you are interested, I would recommend reading the work of Julian Jung, who goes and depicts that. I want to finish this video by looking at what I call the Schopenhauerian Nietzschean line or lineage and how that can relate to the world today. I'm sure many people have heard of the topic or the concept of gender performativity by Judith Butler, and this idea that we don't have any kind of essential gender or identity. We perform it, and by performing it, we construct it. That comes from Gender Trouble, Judith Butler's book on the topic, and she acknowledges in that work that she derives this from Nietzsche's genealogy of morals, and she also, to her credit, acknowledges that her extrapolation from this would not be something that Nietzsche would agree with. So I'm just going to read the part that she develops this theory from and talk about how that relates to Schopenhauer. So she says here, Nietzsche says here, but no such substratum exists, talking about below the action, below the existence. There is no being behind doing, acting, becoming. The doer is merely a fiction imposed on the doing. The doing itself is everything. So based on that, Judith Butler says, see, yes, it's our performativity. That's where we become male or female, on and on from there. However, she ignores that previous to this, just further up in the paragraph, Nietzsche says to demand of strength, and this would be the essence, the strength, that it should not express itself as strength, almost sounds like gender expression, that it should not be a will to overcome, overthrow, dominate, a thirst for enemies and resistance and triumph, makes as little sense as to demand of weakness that it should express itself as strength. So even though he's not directly saying this, I think Nietzsche is implying that there is this essence and we see this expression of it, but it's the same thing. And that would concord with what Schopenhauer says, and I'm going to give you two different books from this. So one here is The Two Fundamental Problems of Ethics, which I think is probably the best place to begin with Schopenhauer, because he wrote these essays anonymously, so he doesn't refer to his other works like he does in all of his other books. But in this, he says, our deeds are simply no first beginning, for in them nothing actually new attains existence. No new knowledge. Rather, through that which we do, we simply experience what we are. And this should sound familiar if you know Nietzsche. One of his famous quotes are, become what you are, right? So again, through that which we do, we simply experience what we are, because our essence, our being is just a objectification of that essence. And developing this a little bit more in book 4, which is on the ethics in this work, He says, Schopenhauer says, the will is first and original. Knowledge is merely added to it as an instrument belonging to the phenomenon of the will. Therefore, every man is what he is through his will, and his character is original, for willing is the basis of his inner being. Through the knowledge added to it, he gets to know in the course of experience what he is. In other words, he becomes acquainted with his character. Therefore, he knows himself in consequence of and in accordance with the nature of his will, instead of willing in consequence of and according to his knowing, as in the old view. And the old view he mentions here is, he talks about Descartes and Spinoza having this concept that, man learns what is good through experience and then tries to, get more of that. But Schopenhauer is saying, no, what is good is just good in relation to the will. And as you go through life, you're learning more about what you are, what your will wants. So again, this sounds very much like what Nietzsche was saying in that quote. Again, I think they're in agreement here. And further, he's saying that this is the process of we're discovering our essence through our existence, which again would be refuting existentialism. Going on a little further, though, he says, according to this view, we need only consider how he would best like to be, and he would be so. This is the freedom of the will. Again, this is the old view that he's disagreeing with. It therefore consists in man's being his own work in light of knowledge. You creating your own work, your own what you are, creating what you are. I, on the other hand, say that he is his own work prior to all knowledge, and knowledge is merely added to illuminate it. So we are our own work already, and we're discovering it through the process. Therefore, he cannot decide to be this or that. Also, he cannot become another person. Okay, this is a direct shot at Butler, even though obviously this precedes her. But he is once for all, and subsequently knows what he is. With those other thinkers, he wills what he knows. With me, he knows what he wills. So, to me, it's clear that Nietzsche was grappling with these ideas with Schopenhauer in this book, and then later we see that with Butler, but again, without the understanding of the context, or at least without bringing that into the discussion. And again, I'm calling that academy capture of philosophy or professional deformation. It is a problem, so we should try to correct it. And that's what I'm trying to do with this video. Thank you for listening.